So today is Tuesday, August 20. And when's the test? Tomorrow, Wednesday, August 21st. So the first thing we're going to do when we come in tomorrow, we're going to take an open note quiz on whatever we covered today. It's the first thing we're going to do. It'll take 10 or 15 minutes because we're going to take it, pass it forward. I'm going to pass it back. We're going to grade it in class. And then we're going to take a closed book test. That means closed book means you do not need to get to open up a textbook. You do not get to open up your notes. So that's a normal test. You get pencils, you get pens, you got to bring them yourself, and then you have to write things on the paper, and all of that information has to somehow come out of your brain, down your arm, into your fingers, and wiggle the pencil correctly. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, well, let's talk. Go ahead, Rigoberto. What's going to be on the test? Everything we covered on Wednesday last week, which is on a video posted on YouTube. You type in John C. Johnson on YouTube. You find that handsome guy that's about 20 years older than me. I mean, younger than me. Thanks. Younger than me. And you look for playlists. One of those first or second, it's the first or second playlist. I can't remember which it is. It says Aviation VROP Fall 2019. You click on that, and after today, there's going to be 3 videos. One from last Wednesday, one from yesterday, Monday, and this one here today. So if you weren't here last week to take notes on that lecture from last week, then you need to go online and take notes. Now, you probably don't remember, especially if you weren't here that first couple of days. You've got 7 days to make up work you didn't do. So last week on Thursday, the previous day to that, we had lecture. So guess what we do when the next day is when the previous day is a lecture? We take an open note quiz. So if you didn't take that quiz last Thursday, you have through Thursday this week to take it and still get points. And I'd love for everybody to get full points. I'll take it. Does anybody, could you write your name right there? Oh, yeah, for sure. Does anybody else have any paperwork to bring in? They told me they gave me one extra day. So today after class, I'm driving to Valley ROP. Their headquarters is in beautiful downtown Sanger next to the high school. And I'm going to turn in all this lovely paperwork, and then they're going to start looking through it and see who didn't turn it in. Okay. So if you didn't take the quiz on Thursday last week, you need to go online and watch the video from Wednesday, August 14. Because you can come in and take the quiz, and it'll be open note. Sweet. Then the test that's tomorrow is going to be off of assuming you take really good notes, you'll have notes from 3 days, and the test is going to cover everything from last Wednesday and from yesterday and from today. Somebody asked that question, what's going to be on the test? Does anybody have any questions about what's going to be on the test? The test, go ahead. The questions will be varied. There will be some multiple choice. There'll be some fill in the blank. That'll say something like, name 27 of the 20 blah, 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 blah. And you'll write the first 20 because that's all you know. And then 21 through 27 you won't know, so you get those wrong. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, if there's a list that says, name the 5, what are the 3 main jet engines that are being produced in the United States right now? Turbojets, turbofans, and, turbojets aren't being produced anymore. I better watch out how I ask that question. So there's going to be, and there might be some where you have to draw pictures. If I drew pictures on the board, then you need to expect to be able to draw that same diagram with much better artistic capability than I drew. Because that's half the points is your artistic I'm just kidding. No points for artistic. Aaron? There's going to be some multiple choice, and there's going to be some fill in the blank, and then there's going to be some flat out, name the 2 people credited. So right now you've had some of you that have taken both quizzes, you have a good idea of what my questions are like. Although, yes, so far I haven't given you any multiple choice questions. Maybe I'll do that for tomorrow. Question?
Can I take the last Thursday's quiz during break today?
Yes, you may. You may take last Thursday's quiz during break today or anytime through Thursday. Before school, after school, I know that's tough for a lot of people, or at break. All right, so this lecture is about how to become a pilot. If you want to train to become a pilot, this is going to have a lot of good information. I'm going to have some stuff in it in addition to pilot stuff. So Federal Aviation Administration, that's the government agency that is the same equivalent as the DMV. Has anybody ever heard of the DMV? Or in Arizona, it's the MVD. It's the Motor Vehicle Department, not the Department of Motor Vehicles. So at the Department of Motor Vehicles, they do written tests and they do driving tests so you can get your driver's license. Okay, the FAA is responsible for making up the written test and the flying test to get pilot certificates. We generally abbreviate it with 3 letters, capital F, capital A, capital A. That is different than FFA, which is the Future Farmers of America. Is anybody a member of the FFA? You were? Yeah, sorry, the FAA does not have nice blue jackets with big yellow letters on the back. Sorry. Does the FFA still have blue jackets with yellow letters on them? They still do? Okay, all right. So it's FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. So they're in charge of aviation in the United States, and there's 4 basic sets of regulations that the FAA produces. And I'm giving you these abbreviations because in aviation, everybody knows these abbreviations. FARs stands for Federal Aviation Regulations. Capital F, capital A, capital R stands for Federal Aviation Regulations. Just as an aside, don't write this part down, okay? Is it okay if I tell you something you don't have to write down? No, make us write it down. Okay, You go get, anybody in here get a driver's license in California in the last couple of years? A few people? I came in from out of state, from Arizona, and they made me take the written test. They didn't make me take the driving test, but I had to take the written test. So I went down, I got the booklet. You know, it's about yay big, and it's about 1/8 of an inch thick. Is that correct? Okay, all right. How many do you have to get correct? Aye. What? Please, you are welcome. I'm going to hit pause on my recorded lecture, and you can speak to your heart's content. So, there's basically 4 kinds of regulations. I'll give you a chance to write it down before I talk anymore. There we go. Aaron. Yes, it's different in some ways, but it's the same in some ways. For instance, in California, if you're 16 years old and you get a driver's license, if you go to Enterprise Rent a Car, are they going to rent you a car at 16 years? Right, they probably won't let you rent it till you're at least 21, maybe 25. Okay, but is that the law, or is it just the company doesn't want to rent it to you because they think you're going to have a crash? It's not the law. Yeah, it's insurance. Their insurance would be so expensive they'd have to charge you $500 a day to rent that car, and they know nobody's going to pay $500 a day to rent a car. Okay, if you're 16, to get a pilot certificate to fly a small airplane, you only have to be 17. Don't write that down yet. If you turn 17 and you earn your pilot certificate, the flight school where you learned how to fly, they will rent you that airplane. And at 17 years old, right now, today, the insurance that they pay for covers people to fly the airplane when they're 17 years old. You have to do what? If you have a pilot certificate, and let's say you learn to fly at a flight school in Fresno, and you have relatives that live in Los Angeles. So you go to the airport in Santa Monica, and there's a flight school that rents airplanes, little airplanes. You go there and you show them your pilot certificate and stuff, and they'll want to do a 1-hour flight with you, here's the deal with the insurance company. They'll do a 1-hour flight with you that you'll have to pay for the airplane and pay for the instructor. And when that 1-hour flight is done, they'll let you rent that airplane just like you could have rented it at the flight school in Fresno where you learned how to fly. That's what the insurance requirements. There's not an age restriction. They're going under the assumption that if you went through the trouble, to study enough to pass the written test, and you went through the trouble to pass the oral exam, the verbal exam on the check ride, and then pass the check ride where you're flying around, that you know what you're doing and you're not going to be silly. Question.
So I know with the California driver's license, you have to have a certain kind of license to drive a certain kind of vehicle. Is it the same for pilots?
It's similar. We'll get to that in a minute, so don't write it down yet. But usually when you get a private pilot certificate, you do it in a small airplane that has 2 seats, maybe 4. It goes about 100 miles an hour. It costs anywhere from $120 to $170 an hour, and it's only got 1 engine. And when you get your pilot certificate in a single-engine airplane, you can fly any single-engine airplane as long as it doesn't weigh more than 12,500 pounds, which is about the same as 2 Ford F-150 pickup trucks that are empty. That's a pretty big airplane. But usually, you can't afford to do that, and nobody has that airplane for rent. A big single-engine airplane that'll seat 12 people, nobody's renting that. Almost all the rental airplanes out there are either 2 seats, 4 seats, and a very few places you can rent a 6-seat airplane. Yeah.
The reason I'm asking is because I'm hoping to buy a 6-seater.
Well, we all have our hopes and dreams, and I hope yours comes true. I'm trying not to be funny. A 6-seat airplane, the cheapest one you can buy that's safe to fly, is going to be somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000. And then, if you barely get your pilot certificate, it'll probably be $5,000 a year for the insurance up front. And then it'll cost you between about $200 to $250 an hour when you fly it to pay for gas and maintenance. So there's an old saying in aviation. You don't have to write this down. There's an old saying in aviation. If you want to end up with $1 million in aviation, you need to start out with $2 million. Because whatever you do, it's going to cost a lot of money. So I want to go back to the motor vehicle department, the DMV in California. When I changed over from Arizona, they made me take the written test. I studied the book. I went to an online cram thing where they gave me questions, and I could try to answer the questions and get good at it. Fortunately for me, my wife took her test first, and she told me all the answers. She missed 2 or 3 or something like that, including, don't say it out loud. I want to see how many people know. Don't say it. Just raise your hand if you know the answer. How much is the fine in dollars if you abandon an animal on the side of the highway? There's a fine, and don't say it out loud. How many people do you know the answer? As it turns out, most of the fines, if you don't count the driving it drunk, almost all the fines are $1,000. And that's the one she missed. So guess what? A month later, when I took mine, sure enough, one of the questions, what's the fine if you abandon an animal by the side of the highway? So she was kind of perturbed. It's like, what? You got that right? Because I told you the answer. All right. Well, so if you want to get a driver's license so you can drive a car in the state of California, you go to the DMV. If you want to register a car so you can own a car, you got to register it with the DMV. Now, what if you want to fix a car? Can you just pull it up on your driveway and pop the hood and start working on it in California? Yeah, you don't have to have a license to be a car mechanic. Now, maybe you won't be a very good one, but you don't have to have a license to be a car mechanic. You can legally work on a car in California. You can even charge money for it, and people can pay you. That's one of the differences right there where it says repairing aircraft. If you want to repair an aircraft, you have to have a mechanic certificate from the FAA. That bottom there where it says certification of airmen, that's how to get your pilot certificate. When we say driver's license, it actually says driver's license. but when you get a card from the FAA, it's an airman certificate. So like I'm a certificated airman. Airman? Like, let's see. I got a couple of these floating around here. So let's see. Here's my mechanic certificate. You notice it doesn't have my picture on it. And this is my commercial pilot certificate. So this is the same as a driver's license, except it allows me to fly airplanes and helicopters and gliders. And that's my mechanic certificate, so that allows me to fix airplanes and helicopters, even if I don't want to get paid. Question? Yeah. Well, if you want to fly a helicopter, you have to take another written test and take an oral exam and then fly a helicopter on the flying test. It's not the same as an airplane. It's very different. And in fact, it's much harder to fly a helicopter, which if you're up for a challenge, I remember the first time I flew a helicopter, I had about 700 hours flying airplanes, and I could fly multi-engine airplanes, and I was a flight instructor, and I took my first helicopter flying lesson, and we tried to hover it, take it off the ground, and just stay in one spot. After about 5 seconds, the instructor had to take the controls and say, I got it, and settled it down, and said, okay, you want to try it again? Yeah. So I got the controls, and the helicopter was going, and he says, I've got it. He takes the controls, he's really nice about it, takes the controls, gets it settled down. So about 5 or 10 times in a row, I couldn't hold on to the helicopter for even 5 seconds. Now we left the airport and did some other flying there where I was a little bit better. But I left the airport driving my motorcycle. This is back when I was silly, and I ride my motorcycle, and I thought, I am going back, and I'm going to learn how to ride that motorcycle. I mean, how to fly that helicopter. So I did, but it was a lot harder than flying an airplane, and I was a very experienced airplane pilot, and I had a really hard time. I'm not trying to convince you don't be a helicopter pilot, but it's a couple of notches up there above being an airplane pilot. So, certification of airman, this is the same as getting a driver's license. And operating repairing aircraft, you have to have a mechanic certificate. And this operating aircraft. So, in the motor vehicles, most of what it says in that DMV booklet is how to drive safe, right? Stay 3 seconds behind and slow down to 25 miles an hour. I'm afraid we don't eat in class anymore. I forgive you, but don't do it anymore, thanks. Those certificates still floating around? I would like both of them back at some point. I mean, I want to get everybody a chance to look at it. Most of that booklet is the law, like follow the speed limit, use your turn signal, right? Doesn't it say things like that? What's the speed limit in a school zone? You know, when is it safe to pass? So there's a lot of federal aviation regulations, FARs, that tell you what you can do when you fly. There actually is a speed limit. You know, if you're above 10,000, you don't have to write this down. If you're above 10,000 feet in the United States, the speed limit is don't go supersonic and make a sonic boom. I'm not making that up. If you're above 10,000 feet in the United States, there's only one speed limit. Don't make a sonic boom by going supersonic. So you can push the throttle up and go 500, 600, 695. You can go all the way up to Mach 0.9, 0.95, 0.96. Just don't make a sonic boom. Now that's if you're a civilian aircraft. If you're a military aircraft, none of these rules apply. But don't worry, they have their own military regulations. Question?
Like, has anyone actually ever done that, though, in like the recent history? It's not like that happened.
Yeah, there's some old, thanks, Aaron. There's some old military jets that can go supersonic, and they got permission from the FAA to go supersonic. Because they know if they did it without permission, that they'd say, you're not flying your airplane anymore. So, to review this right here, so if I was going to ask you questions off of this on a test, I would say FAA is a 3-letter abbreviation for what 3 words? And you would write, okay, I'm just giving you sample questions. I'm glad that you know the answer. That's awesome. And here would be another great question. I would say the federal aviation regulations can have 4 different sets. You could write it like this. You could say there's a set of rules that says how to be a pilot. So if you want to cross out certification of airman and and it's easier to remember how to be a pilot, how to become a pilot. Operating aircraft, that's the same as rules of the road. If you prefer rules of the road, because you can remember that better, I would accept that answer. Repairing aircraft. You got to have the FAA writes regulations on repairing aircraft. I don't know if there's an easier way to remember that. And the one we haven't covered yet is manufacturing aircraft. If I go home in my garage and I weld up a bunch of steel and put wheels and tires and steering and a body and a windshield and stuff on it, I'm not saying I could do that. I could not. Could I build a car in my house, in my garage? I'd probably have to tow it to the motor vehicle department, and they would look at it and see if I had a serial number on it, and they'd register it, and I'm telling you, you could drive that car on the road. And there's no law that says you have to be a good car designer or a good car builder. That is not the case with flying machines. With airplanes and helicopters and balloons and blimps and everything else that flies, their FAA has regulations you have to comply with. So if you want, you don't have to write this down, but if you want to build an aircraft and then turn around and sell it, the FAA has to approve it. And it's a ridiculously long process. So we're not used to thinking about that. That clock right there says 24 after. Let's go until 36 after. That's about 12 minutes from now. 36 after on that clock. Please come back here at 36 after on that clock. If you need to take a quiz, then we can take care of that right now. So there's three kinds of certificates that the FAA gives to humans. There's actually more than three, but I want to stick to just three because these are if you added up all of the people in the United States that had a certificate from the FAA, this would probably comprise more than 99% of them. You know, if you want to pack a parachute, you have to be certificated by the FAA. Don't write this down, but you have to be a parachute rigger. You have to take a written test, an oral test, and a practical test where you show an FAA employee or a very experienced parachute rigger, somebody that packs parachutes. Same thing for these things. For pilots, mechanics, and air traffic controllers, if you want to be a pilot or an aircraft mechanic or be an air traffic controller, you have to get a certificate from the FAA. There's other jobs besides this out there, and when you get to careers in aviation, that class is the first half of next semester in January. You're going to probably look at 20 or 30 different careers in aviation. What I want to do is talk just a little bit about these. Yes?
If you wanted to work on like aviation, like planes or whatever,
yeah.
in the military, would you need one of those?
That's a great question. If you want to work on aircraft in the military, do you need to be certified by the FAA? And the answer is no, not at all. Let's just say, for instance, you say, you know what, I've been thinking about joining the U.S. military, and I think I want to be an aircraft mechanic. Well, the good news is all of the U.S. military services, the Coast Guard, the Marines, the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force, they all have aircraft, and they all have aircraft mechanics. Now, the process is different about getting a guarantee as to whether you're going to go to aircraft mechanic school, which we're not going to talk about today, but if you want to talk outside of class, I'd be happy to talk to you about what I know and my advice for you to get more data. But let's say you decide, you know what, I want to be an aircraft mechanic and I want to work on helicopters. The Army has a lot of helicopters. I'm going to join the Army to be an aircraft mechanic. If they pick you to be an aircraft mechanic, they will send you to helicopter mechanic school. And the military doesn't have to follow any of these civilian regulations. So whenever they think you can work on a helicopter, that's when you can do it. Now, when you get out, if you want to work on civilian helicopters, now you're going to have to take the written test and the oral test and that's when it would apply, is when you get out and you want to be a civilian mechanic. Is that answering your question? So, I'm sorry I haven't said your name very often. What's your name? I'll pick it up now. Ta-da. Let's just see, just for fun. Is it working? Yeah, it's working. So she reads up a lot on learning and stuff like that, and it's not just kindergartners, but it's everybody of other ages. When that moment, when you think of that question and you want to know the answer, that's the best time to get it. It'll sink in a lot better. So mechanics are people that fix airplanes and helicopters and stuff like that. They do the fixing. They have tools. They get greasy. Sometimes they don't get greasy. You can work on aircraft and not get greasy. The pilots are the people that drive the airplanes and the helicopters. Drone, on the first day or the second day, I pass around my drone pilot certificate. It says remote pilot. You can be a licensed pilot. Does anybody remember what's going to happen during the second half of this semester? Pilot. Yeah, that's right. One of the two college classes you're going to, if you're still here, which I want you to be, I hope you are, is you're going to take a class, remote pilot, so you can take the written test to get that plastic card that says remote pilot with your name on it. You got to be at least 16 years old. The test is $150, and the Reedley College Foundation is going to pay that $150 for everybody that can get at least an 85% on a practice test in class. So by the end of the semester, you could have a remote pilot certificate if you want. Now, I'm not saying you're going to go out there and get a job flying a drone, but technically, you could have somebody pay you money to fly a drone and take pictures or movies or, or something like that. If you don't get the remotes, if you don't get the certificate, you can still fly drones around. You just can't do it for pay.
Is there any place near us that will pay you to do drones? Because that's an interesting thing.
You know what? I have not done a search on Google or Firefox or anywhere else to find what jobs are out there for drone pilots. Question?
So when we finish this class,
Yeah.
there's another class we take to become a mechanic?
Is there another class you can take to be a mechanic after this class is over? The answer is yes. What we're going to do is the last half of next semester. So it's that fourth quarter of this year, approximately March, April into May. This class, we're going to do a day or two, probably a little bit, about a day and a half of lecture, and then 2.5 days of lab in aircraft mechanic lab. So you're going to get greasy. Okay, you don't have to get greasy. We're going to turn wrenches, and I like to work on engines and then take them outside and tie them down and fire them up and make the propeller spin around and try not to chop my head off. I really enjoy not chopping my head off. It's one of my favorite activities, is not chopping my head off. In any case, because the reason we do that is so people have a feeling for, okay, this is kind of what it's like to fix airplanes, and this is kind of what it's like to go to aircraft mechanic school. If you decide to go to aircraft mechanic school, you can go to Reedley College. In this room is the ground school part, and out there is the lecture part, the lab part, and it's 4 semesters, and it's 7 a.m. until 1:50 with a 30-minute lunch. And it's there's no lab fee, so it's very inexpensive. And if your folks like you enough to let you live at home when you go to college, then it's pretty cheap. My folks liked me enough. They let me live at home while I went to Reedley College. This is where I went to aircraft mechanics. I think it's the same tile. What's that? I sat in the back. I did only because Mr. Troller was one of the instructors back then. You know Mr. Troller? Is that why you're?
No,
It's a pretty funny name. If you fell asleep in class, this is before dry erase markers. You see those chalkboards? There used to be chalkboards up there. If he saw you fall asleep in class and he turned around and you were asleep, he would throw that chalk and it would hit you in the head. I'm not making this up. This is before you could. This is when you could still hurt students. I didn't say I was a troublemaker. I said I sat in the back of the class so the chalk wouldn't hurt so much. I worked really, really hard to stay awake. I had a night job. I was working at the Foster's Freeze Drive-In here in Reedley till 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night, and I had to get up in the morning and be in class at 7 taking notes. So I worked at it, man. I was biting my lip and all kinds of stuff to stay awake, drinking coffee and all those terrible things. Just to be clear, I never took any illegal drugs to do that. Yeah. Why are you laughing? I drank a lot of coffee and I bit my lip to stay awake, but Mr. Troller never caught me sleeping, and so he never threw a piece of chalk at me. But yes, I sat in the back to reduce the risk of bodily injury. Troublemaker. I didn't cause trouble in school. I caused trouble many other places. Okay. So the FAA certifies, gives certificates like those plastic cards I pass around. They give out certificates to pilots if you want to do the flying, to mechanics if you want to do the fixing, and if you want to talk on their radio and tell airplanes to turn left and turn right and climb and descend and make sure that they don't hit each other. Just so you know, that's what air traffic control is there for, is to make sure that airplanes don't hit each other, especially when you're in the clouds and you can't see the other airplanes. You really need to be talking to air traffic control. So if you want to do any of those, you got to go to school, you got to take some written tests, you got to take some oral exams. Question?
Well, what was the first time you almost crashed?
The first time I almost crashed?
Because I'm assuming you haven't crashed.
You're making quite an assumption.
But the closest you've gotten to crashing.
Well, I never told the story what poked my eye out. And then I got an eye transplant. You weren't here last week. Does anybody remember from last week? Did I tell the story about how I lost my left eye? How did I lose it? What was the story I told last week? A model rocket. It curved and flew and went right and hit me. And I was looking kind of down, and it went right over the glasses and got me in the eye. But there was this other time I lost my eye from an aircraft accident. But I got to get this done. We got to have a quiz and a test tomorrow. So there's pictures. Here's pictures of a couple of aircraft mechanics. Here's a picture of a couple of pilots. They're all very happy. They're in air conditioning. There's some air traffic controllers in the tower. They have TV screens and headsets, and they get to look out the window, and they get to drink coffee and eat donuts. But they also work really hard. I think this is I'll tell you right after the test is over tomorrow. So I want to talk about pilot certificates here. A private pilot, you can take your friends and your family flying, but you cannot get paid to do it. So you ought to write private pilot, and you ought to write cannot get paid. You can't. It's not like Uber. You know, you can get a driver's license, and if you're old enough, you can drive for Uber and get paid. Not so with little airplanes. If you get your private pilot certificate, all you can do is take your friends and family with you. They can help share the expenses. Hang on a second. Go ahead.
What about rappers on their own jets and stuff, like private jets?
Yes, they're not sitting in they're paying the pilots. They have to have at least a commercial pilot certificate. If you get a commercial pilot certificate, then you can get paid. So if you write down commercial pilot, you can say gets paid. Question? Okay. Yeah. So you don't have to be a rapper. You could be you could be a country western singer and have a private jet. But the people in the front, if you're paying them to fly, they have to have a commercial pilot certificate so they can get paid. Rigoberto. What can the FAA do to you? If you break a regulation, they can suspend your license for 30 days. They could just write you a letter of reprimand and say shame on you, and shake their finger at you, like the dean, like the dean of boys at the high school. They can. Okay, well, I don't know what they got. They had deans. The dean of boys. Well, we won't talk about my conversation in the dean's office when I was in high school. They can. What can they do if you have a pilot certificate or a mechanic certificate? If you do something wrong, if they think you did it on purpose, they'll probably take your license or suspend your license for 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days. If they think, and that means it automatically comes back after 30 or 60 or 90 days. If you really blew it and they know you knew what you were doing when you blew it, they could take it away for a year. Yeah, they can fine you, but usually they take your pilot certificate away from you. Then if they really think you blew it, they revoke your pilot certificate and it disappears. And then they say in a year, if you take the written test and the oral test and the flying test, you can get it back. And if, like, you're caught smuggling drugs or there's drugs on your plane, You will never get your pilot certificate back, and yes, they will turn you in to the DEA, and the federal government will come after you for whatever federal laws you broke. Question?
So you got your private pilot.
Yeah, so you get your private pilot certificate.
Okay, what if your passengers are pitching in for gas?
The passengers can pitch in for gas, so that's a great question. If you have a private pilot certificate, the passengers can help pay for it, but you have to pay your fair share. So if there's 5 passengers plus you is 6 people, you have to pay at least 1/6 of it. You can pay more. You can pay for all of it and get free rides, but you have to pay at least your fair share. That way the FAA doesn't think you're getting paid for it. Multi-engine pilot, that's if you're going to fly a 2-engined airplane or 3 or 4-engine airplane. So like if you're trying to think, we got rap, we got country western. I'm trying to think another genre of music. If you're a classical music artist and you play the cello and you have a business jet, a private jet, that I don't know if there's a cellist that makes that much money. That airplane has 2 engines. You have to go up for a check ride, a driving test, to prove that you know what to do in case one engine quits. If you only have one engine and it quits, that's easy. You're landing right there, or there, or there. We won't get into that today. But if you got 2 engines, it's a little more complicated. Question?
Like, what's the largest plane you've flown, like, by engine?
Sat in the front and wiggled the sticks? A B-52 bomber that weighed 488,000 pounds. It was at 30,000 feet, and we were doing about a little under 600 miles an hour, halfway between Guam and Hawaii. And then there was another time I was flying a B-52, and we were coming into land, and the aircraft commander let me sit in the co-pilot seat for about 15 minutes. We were going slower.
B-52 is a dual engine.
It's got 8. But I was a navigator on that airplane. I wasn't supposed to sit in the co-pilot seat. But I had all my civilian pilot certificates. So the captain said, oh, okay, all right, don't crash. You know, at 30,000 feet, it's really hard to crash. We were coming into land. He wouldn't let me land the airplane. He said, if you screw up, we'll all be in trouble. So he took the controls and landed it. So I've got about 20 minutes flying a big old honking jet. Don't worry, I'll call Mr. I bet you Mr. Luque Montez will ask sometime this semester, ask if I will come in and tell you about stories flying as a navigator and then a bombardier on that airplane. Because if you haven't noticed, I like talking. An instrument rating allows you to fly through the clouds. It's called an instrument rating because it's as if you were in the clouds and you can't see out the windows and all you can do is look at the instruments and you fly looking at the gauges. Woo-hoo-hoo. Think about that in a car. What if you had a little needle on your car that told you if you were in the middle of the lane or not? Well, you'd stare at it a lot, huh? Problem is there a gauge there that tells you when you're going to bump into another car? Don't worry, in airplanes, we keep the airplanes far apart. Most of the time we keep airplanes 5 miles apart, and that's if they're at the same altitude. Question?
Doesn't air traffic control split the only instrument flights versus the visual flights? They split them so that they're not even close to each other?
No, that's not the case. That's a long story, and I want to have more questions on the test. But airplanes when you get your private pilot certificate, you don't have an instrument rating. You can fly in the day and at night, but you can only fly outside of the clouds. You have to stay away from the clouds. But if there's somebody who's got an instrument rating, they might pop out of a cloud, and then there you are, and you make sure you don't hit each other. So they have an instrument rating, and they're talking to the air traffic control, but you might be flying very close to each other. Is that answering your question? Go ahead, Aaron.
You said earlier about stealth bombers. How do they not get detected?
How do bombers not get detected? Well, the big ones get detected. Unless you're a B-2 bomber. Go ahead. Unless you're a B-2 bomber.
I did a report on the B-2. It's basically you design your plane so the radar sensor slides off, so it's bouncing back towards the radar. And then it's a lot of just, at that point, visual sound.
If the bomber's made out of aluminum, the radio wave hits it and it bounces back, and the radar receives it, it knows where you are. But on a B-2 bomber, the side of the airplane's like this, so it hits and it bounces away and it doesn't get back to the receiver. And there's also coating on the skin that absorbs the radio waves. So it doesn't show up on radar much at all. So you fly it at night and you fly it low and it can't see you on radar. Then you can drop all the bombs you want and kill all. The last one on here is airline transport pilot. And I know I'm making a joke. I used to have this job. I'll tell you a story here when we're about 1 minute to go. So airline transport pilot. If you want to be the aircraft commander, the captain at an airline, you got to get your private, then your instrument, then your commercial, then your multi-engine, and then you got to take one more written test and an oral exam and a flying test to prove that you can fly a big old honking jet. How long does that take? If you go through a program and get the first few pilot certificates, after you get them, you're going to need to fly for about 1.5 years or 2 years more, and then you can get your airline transport pilot certificate. You got to have 1,500 hours of flying to get your airline transport pilot certificate. So if you fly 50 hours a month, it'll take you 30 months, about 2.5 years. Question? Pardon me? I used to have 700. I got a little over 1,000, so I don't have my airline transport pilot certificate. I probably won't. It's not like I'm going to fly an airliner. Question?
Is there like a major pay difference? I was just asking for this. For the airline, if you have an airline transport...
They won't hire you without the airline transport pilot certificate. No, in the United States, we changed the rules a few years ago. You can't even be a co-pilot in an airline in the United States unless you have an airline transport pilot certificate. The pay's lower if you're the co-pilot.
Yeah.
The pay's lower.
Because I want to get into either airline transport or pilot commercial.
Okay, don't buy the airplane. Instead, spend money on flying lessons. So there is a transport category airplane. That's a 737. It's flown by Aeromexico. They fly into Fresno, Yosemite, right? Just for fun, when you learn to get a pilot certificate or a mechanic certificate or an air traffic controller certificate in the United States, you have to be able to read, write, speak, and understand English. If you're an international pilot, say flying for Aeromexico, as soon as you leave Mexico, guess what language they speak on the radio? English. If you fly out of Germany and you fly to another country, the air traffic controller in France, they speak French, but they also speak English. So you're going to write this down because it's going to be on the quiz and the test tomorrow. The international language in aviation is English. So pretty much every airline outside the United States, you have to be bilingual. If you get a job as an airline pilot in Mexico, you need to be able to speak Spanish and you need to be able to speak English. If you get a job as an airline pilot in Brazil, everybody in Brazil speaks Portuguese. But if you're going to be an airline pilot, you also have to speak English. If you become an airline pilot in Canada, I'm making a joke here, you have to be able to speak Canadian and English. I'm just kidding. That is true. There are portions of Canada, that's excellent, where most people speak English. I know a friend of mine who spoke French until he was 18 years old, and he went to the Canadian Air Force Academy, and that's where he started learning to speak English. So you need to come to class tomorrow, ready for the quiz, and guess what else you need to do tonight? Study for the test. Yes, there is a test tomorrow on everything we've covered on the 3 days that we have lectured. I will see you. And bring back the papers. We need the papers. Must have the papers.